Hello everyone, welcome to Pro Manchester's weekly COVID-19 webinar with Grayling Communications. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine and I'm the Membership and Events Manager at Pro Manchester. I'm joined today by Chris Peacock from Grayling Communications and Alison Loveyday, who's a partner at Kennedy's Law. Before I hand over to them, I just want to draw your attention to the Q&A function today. It looks like two little speech bubbles with a question mark. So if you have any questions at any point for Alison or Chris, please feel free to pop them in that chat and we'll address them as soon as possible. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris from Grayling to start us off.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for another webinar and giving you a bit of an update and insight into the latest announcements around the coronavirus, and then followed by a bit of chat and discussion around a particular area that's been relevant to what's been going on. I'm delighted Alison's here today to join me. So I'll start off again as I normally do. For those of you who are regulars on the webinar, we do a little bit of overview of what the announcements have been here in Greater Manchester, then look at the announcements nationally, and then a little bit of overview with some international news, and then I'll hand over to Alison. So to begin with, let's start locally. First of all, there was a really interesting press conference held yesterday with Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, who is Andy's equivalent over in the Liverpool City region. He's their Metro Mayor. They hadn't held a joint press conference like this before during the crisis. It was quite interesting that they decided to come together and they really wanted to focus on discussing the recovery plans for the whole of the north of England, and particularly focusing on how devolved areas like Greater Manchester and the Liverpool City region have an opportunity to be able to help with the recovery if they are given the powers to do so. So one of the first things that they both asked for is an opportunity for the devolved authorities in England to be included in the government's Cobra meetings. So those are the important meetings that are taking place quite regularly now in government, sometimes daily, looking at the issues around coronavirus. They're asking for, because there is representation from Scotland and Wales there and Northern Ireland, but there isn't any for the devolved authorities in England. So Andy was actually saying that he believes someone should be there. He jokingly said that it doesn't have to be him. He'd be more than happy for it to be another mayor, such as Andy Street in Birmingham or possibly Steve in Liverpool or one of the others. But they really felt it's important that they have that voice heard at government. There was also a couple of important pieces of news around travel and transport. We mentioned it last week how Metrolink is looking a little concerning around the finances, because 95% passenger numbers have dropped off, obviously with everyone having to work from home and people not working in the city centre, having to travel as much. And that's caused a massive financial problem for Metrolink. So Andy Burnham has said that he needs to see some form of support from the government. Previous bailout packages for transport have included buses and the national rail network and the franchises for rail, but it's not covered Metrolink or the Liverpool equivalent Merseyrail. Now, the news from this afternoon is that does seem to be coming. So I understand that there is a possibility that a bailout deal or a support package will be put out by the government potentially later this week, and we'll have to wait and see. It's one of those where I regularly say in this webinar, keep your eyes on the news for this, but it does look like it's possibly going to come in the next couple of days. The other things that's also mentioned in yesterday's call was particularly about the call for more powers to the devolved regions of England. Andy, as you'll probably know, has been a huge advocate of wanting more power for Greater Manchester, the opportunity to take control of more budgets, more control over the opportunities to shape the future of Greater Manchester. And they're saying that the coronavirus is a perfect example of why the Greater Manchester, Liverpool City region need greater powers, particularly around transport, air quality, and also Andy mentioned internet provision, and believing that there are local solutions to problems that are taking place here. And if they're given the authority to do it, they feel they can be able to push it forward. Now, Andy always has his Wednesday Greater Manchester Cobra meeting to do with COVID-19 with leaders from Greater Manchester, with the LEP and other senior people. And that has happened again this afternoon. There's been a couple of announcements on the back of that we had to potentially look out for and look forward to. The first, a very exciting topic to discuss, is tips and waste. It's been one of the biggest issues for a lot of people. There's been a large increase of fly tipping across Greater Manchester, and there have been growing calls, particularly from councillors and a couple of council leaders, saying that they want to see the recycling centres and the tips reopened so people can get rid of their waste that way. Now that does look like it is happening. It may be a couple of weeks off because they need to make sure there are safety precautions in case of protecting staff and also people using them. But it does look like that the tips will be reopening. So I know there's a few people who will be really happy to hear about that. Less happy though is the potential bill that Greater Manchester authorities are going to face by the end of this crisis. So Richard Leese has estimated, or said that he's estimated that it's going to cost approximately 541 million to all 10 Greater Manchester authorities. Now, at the moment, the government support is only 89 million, and some further support that was announced this weekend, which I'll come on to in the national overview, has only meant that it'll take it up to 178. So well short of the 541, never mind on top of the restrictions to council budgets that's taken place over the last 10 years. So there's a huge concern what that could look like, and it's certainly one to watch going forward. The local authorities, mayors, are likely to continue to challenge government to make sure that they are financially supported while supporting the city, the towns and businesses around. So moving quickly on to the national picture. Obviously last week we talked a little bit about Boris Johnson still recovering. He is still recovering, although looking at the news this week, he has started taking phone calls, being a bit more involved. I understand he was involved in a telephone call today with Donald Trump. Some of you may think that's probably punishment enough, but we'll leave that there for now. But things seem to be getting better for himself. But again, they aren't rushing his return. They are making sure that he's going to be fully recuperated at Chequers before he comes back to frontline work. We also saw this week, the biggest news was the confirmation that the lockdown restrictions are extended for 3 weeks. We said we expected those to happen, not a big surprise. It's going to be more of a case of seeing what happens in these next 3 weeks to see whether or not there is any further extension, or do they start looking at reducing the lockdown in some way. So also this week, we actually saw yesterday, Matt Hancock announced that there's going to be over 40 million spent in a fund for 2 clinical trials looking into the coronavirus vaccine. So a lot of push from government, particularly Department of Health, trying to find the vaccine, not just for UK citizens, but also there is almost an international competition now, it feels, for countries to find the vaccine and to be the first one to create it. Certainly in Europe and North America, there are real big pushes on this, and Matt Hancock has really laid down the challenge to say he really wants to sort a vaccine as quickly as possible, and all restrictions that have been previously put in place of vaccines developments that usually takes a couple of years have been scaled back massively to try and help facilitate it. And I understand the first trials are taking place tomorrow to see how successful it is. So things are moving quite quickly on that. Also in the world of politics today, we've seen for the first time in its history, Parliament sits in a hybrid system whereby we have some MPs in the House of Commons and others watching remotely, a bit like ourselves today, watching through computers and being involved. Those of you like me who watch Prime Minister's Questions every week, it was a unique situation where, first of all, the Commons chamber was very quiet, but also having MPs asking questions by video link. It seemed to work quite well, so it'll be interesting to see how this develops and goes further and beyond. I suspect, having worked with MPs in the past, that they won't want this to be the new normal. They like to be in the chamber, they like to be in Westminster. So I wouldn't expect this to be a long-term change, but we'll have to see how it goes for the next few weeks. We've also seen some announcements from the government around business support. So we have now seen the final details of the large business support, large business loan support. That's now been sorted by the Chancellor and come out. Further details are available. Obviously, Monday this week, we saw the coronavirus job retention scheme the gun was fired and started off. I'm going to ask Alison to talk more about that particularly, because it's more of her area of expertise, but just a headline that it's there. But ultimately, through all of this week, we've seen quite a shift in change in terms of the challenge of government and what they're being checked on. I think last week we talked, and the week before actually, we talked quite a bit about how government was being challenged by the press over their plan for coming out of lockdown. The press were particularly quizzing them on what is the plan going to be? What's it going to look like? Are we going to have a discussion around the plan? That seems to have quietened off these last few days, and the focus has, and quite rightly, been focused on PPE, the criticism and struggles government has had, whether it is the delayed shipments that was coming from Turkey. We had a situation at the weekend when we were told it was here and it hadn't even been ordered, allegedly, according to some of the press. Also, there's been a really interesting story, which you may have seen in the last 48 hours, around whether or not the UK joined the European-wide PPE procurement scheme, and also why they did it or why they didn't, and who made that decision. There's been a really interesting little soap opera taking place between the civil service, government and the press about who has said what and when, which saw one of the most senior civil servants write a letter to the Health Select Committee, I think it was, saying how they had misspoken at the Select Committee and given a completely incorrect answer. It's quite unique to see that. So to see a senior official from the civil service to almost completely reverse their decision is quite unique. So that's been quite an interesting one to see. But I think the PPE one is one that's going to continue. It has been a running theme in the last few weeks anyway, but now particularly it does seem to be the main focus and drive, and that is going to continue on, I think, certainly. You may have seen a particularly critical article of the government in the Sunday Times this weekend. Government have been really strong and jumping on it and coming down saying how incorrect it is, and we've seen that a couple of times now from government where the press have reported on stories and they've really reacted quickly to it. And I think that really says a lot about what the government's plans are and their communication strategy. They do not want any misinformation to come out, and if they feel the press have misinformed the public on something, they're really jumping on their throats on it and saying, no, this is incorrect, this is the situation. And I think that's an interesting one, because when I was preparing for today, I think there's actually a lot less major announcements that's come out this week. And I think we're now seeing with the government a lot less new information coming. We're still seeing those examples of where there are loopholes in the support schemes they've set up, or there are areas which haven't been covered. So, for example, the public transport side of things with Metrolink and Merseyrail, similarly with business loan supports, where businesses are falling between the cracks of the rules they've set out. So we're seeing them responding to those. However, there's a big lack now of major announcements. I think we're in that phase now where the government has to continue with their daily briefings to update people of what's going on, but there isn't any as big announcements that are coming. And I think that's something that is just going to continue as we go further. The government will spend a lot of its time trying to challenge where they believe there is unfair criticism or incorrect reporting, rather than big new announcements that are being made. So the last thing I wanted to mention about national is, yes, local government is supposed to be getting more money. They announced over the weekend, the community secretary, that there would be an additional £1.6 billion of finance to local authorities. That would increase the amount of funding they've already committed to up to 3.2 billion. But as I've mentioned earlier, particularly here in Manchester, they just simply do not believe that's going to be enough. So that is another thing to keep an eye on and to watch, that local authorities who are already stretched in terms of finances are going to be even further so by this. Very quickly, just a couple of headlines from Europe and internationally. Anyone who is interested in the United States, the madness that goes on over there is continuing. We're seeing the President Donald Trump at loggerheads with some of the state governors on how quickly the country should lift its COVID-19 restrictions, with the president pushing for a really fast timeline to get the economy started as quickly as possible. That is a developing story that will go on and on. And if anyone has the resilience to watch one of Donald Trump's press briefings, I can only applaud you. It is hard going at times. Other bits of news, in Ireland, the finance minister has said that the country is set for a severe recession, saying that the economy will shrink by 10% this year, and likely that unemployment will go up to 22% by June. The other bit of news just to mention is we are seeing a lot of European nations now starting to ease those restrictions on lockdowns, but each are taking it slightly differently. There is no uniform way that a country is coming out, which others are following. It's very, very different in each country, and I think that's something to see here. We aren't going to have a similar process of lockdown. I think it's going to be very heavily driven by the science, and there'll be a lot of pressure from business, local governments, people like Andy Burnham, Metro mayors on the government on how the lockdown works and how it is eased in. Obviously, we've seen rumours of schools being likely to be first. Some countries are doing that, but not all. So it's going to be one to watch over the next few weeks to see what happens next. And that is mainly everything. There's lots more that I could cover, but I don't want to bore you too much. And it's important that we try and condense everything that's happened in the last week as best we can. So with that, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Alison Loveyday from Kennedy's, who very kindly said is going to come and speak to us a little bit about the furlough scheme and what's been happening with that. So thank you very much, Alison.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Right, I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview. That's what Chris has asked me to do, and then happy to take any questions that come through. And I think there's some interesting sort of commentary up and around the scheme and how people are trying to sort of pick their way through it. I think the first thing I'd say is we had the announcement from Rishi Sunak, relatively early, to say that the government were very appreciative of the need to support businesses and support employees. And then some detail came out, but it wasn't until last week on the 15th of April where Treasury actually gave the directive to HMRC, where it was all, sort of nailed down a bit tighter. And it has to be said, in the period in between, so between the 20th of March when it was initially announced to then, there have been quite a few variations. So different guidance notes have been issued by Gov.uk. They go up on the site, and then we're all sort of trying to analyse them and understand what those changes mean. And there have been some differences between what's included in the advisory guides for employers and employees. So this more recent directive has cleared up some of those anomalies, but not all of them. So in summary, what is this JRS, the Job Retention Scheme? Its initial focus is about protecting jobs. So it was very much pitched at what the government was planning to do to step in to try and avoid mass redundancies, which it was being told by businesses would follow if they didn't do something. So it's pretty bold action. I don't think anybody anticipated our Conservative government going quite as far as they did, but they have agreed to effectively give employers up to 80% of wages for their employees. There is a cap on that of £2,500 per month, but it is to cover all employees who are on the PAYE payroll. So in addition to the 2,500 cap, there is some additional money there for employers' national insurance and also the auto enrolment contribution, but that's it. So if you were a high earner and you were furloughed, you'd still only get that, arguably, certainly from the government. There is then a question of whether your pay will be topped up by your employer. They're not obliged to under the scheme, but some employers are making that salary up to 100%. I'd also say that lots of employees have agreed to accept 80% if the alternative is redundancy. So there are just a few issues around that, really. So you are asking employees to vary their contracts of employment. They have an expectation to work and have an expectation to be paid for that work. Now, the whole point of a furlough scheme, it's a very new term to us here in the UK. It's used quite a lot in America, but it's effectively a paid leave of absence. So you're absent from work, but you are paid at that 80% rate unless your employer agrees to top it up. But then you mustn't do any work at all. So it's not a case of just agreeing to a reduction in hours. It's not a case of working from home. There is a positive obligation on the employee and the employer to agree that they won't undertake any work. So some employers, so that they can effectively evidence that, are doing things like taking people off the IT system so it can be shown that they weren't receiving emails or being asked to do things. And the government have said, I think at the moment they will process the claims, but they are expecting employers to keep their records for up to 5 years. And they will have a whistleblowing hotline, and they will be checking. So they will be looking out for fraudulent claims. And I think that's something that to be borne in mind. The idea of this agreement between the employer and employee has also changed from when the scheme was first announced. Initially, it was just described as a notification by the employer to the employee that they were being furloughed. The employee would have to agree if there was going to be a reduction in pay and they were only going to get the 80%, but it seemed quite straightforward. The HMRC directive, on the other hand, now said that that agreement must be in writing. So there are a number of employers who have already furloughed staff and who may not have got that prior agreement. So it's a question of whether or not HMRC will accept it if they can't evidence it. The suggestion is that they will, because the guidance that was issued right from the start suggests that notification is what's required and that evidence of a written agreement isn't necessary. But certainly going forward, that's what employers should obtain. Other changes, which I'll just mention quickly, are the actual qualifying period. So the scheme was initially to run from the 1st of March to the end of May. It wasn't announced till the 20th of March, but it was effectively going to be backdated. And you had to be on the PAYE system by the end of February. It's now been changed, so that date is the 19th of March, so it would include employees right up until the day before the scheme was announced, but they have an additional requirement, and this is that you will be on the real-time information software which HMRC have for payroll. So we do have a situation where some employees may have joined after the payroll for March was done and not be on the real-time information system, in which case arguably they're not eligible. So some of these things are just anomalies and they may all come out in the wash, but they are certainly anomalies for now. Similarly, there are questions around holiday pay and sick pay. There are quite a lot of questions flying around about commission and bonuses. It does seem that they're not intended to be included because there is an exclusion for conditional payments. But these are the sorts of questions that certainly I'm regularly being asked. Also, people on 0 hours contracts, agency workers. As you can imagine, I think the scheme is there and the framework is there, but you have to drill down into the detail to look at individual circumstances. So I hope that's enough of a flavour, Chris, just to get us going.
No, definitely, Alison. I think I actually, so many questions is probably the best way to describe the ending of that, really is. And I think that actually that really emphasises the problem that government has at times with all of this. And you mentioned then about the number of updates and changes that were required. I think particularly given the scale of what the government is facing and the support that has been put in, it's never been done before. And it's inevitable that there will be issues and things that haven't been thought of, particularly when policy is being made so quickly. It does mean that decisions and how things will work do miss things out, and that's where it's really important, I think, for government to hear exactly what the problems are, and that's why feeding back to people such as Andy Burnham and to fair as well, Pro Manchester as well, and others, and even to your local MPs, to actually say this is the problem we're facing. You need to raise this. This is a loophole that's been missed or a gap. But again, yeah, I think there's always more questions than answers as these processes go on. So I think that's a really interesting one to look at. So we're going to do a quick Q&A now, just for the next 10 minutes or so, just to round up. I know we've had a couple of questions that have come in as we've been speaking as well, so I was going to tackle those first. I think the first one we've had is from Azim regarding face masks. He asks, any news about face masks being compulsory after lockdown? On face masks, Azim, there hasn't been any official decision yet. I suspect, this is my personal opinion, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone directly on this, I don't think the government wants to be tied down to an official line on face masks at this given time. Their entire focus is on trying to secure PPE. If they suddenly came out saying that everyone going outside, even now for their allowed exercise or for their shopping, to use face masks, the sudden rush on face masks would be a nightmare to try and organise and coordinate if every person in the UK was supposed to have one. I do wonder whether once we look towards post-lockdown as one of the ways to help get people out and moving again, whether it's something that's recommended by them or they're looking at. I wouldn't be surprised, but certainly at the moment there's no official news on face masks being used or being compulsory after lockdown. I think that's something we will need to wait on further for. Another question that we've had, I think this is probably for you, Alison, if you don't mind me asking it. Do you think the CJRS is too generous in terms of the percentage rate and other anomalies, such as repaying employers 80% of Easter holiday pay?
It's a good question, and Chris and you and I discussed yesterday how the UK government's response varies perhaps to other governments when you look more broadly. I think if we didn't have the 2,500 cap, then clearly it would be too generous just to say 80% of people's salaries. I think provided it's used in the right way, I think it's a fair percentage. What you have to remember is the government is asking employers and employees to accept changes to what they've already agreed. So they have an agreement there. An employee could legitimately hold their employer to account and say, look, you know, I'm entitled to 100% of salary, I'm entitled to a car, I'm entitled to all these other benefits as well as my salary. I'd like them all, please. But, you know, employees are having to be sensible and understand that actually to still have a job, to be paid at the rate that they are, in the hope that they will be able to go back into that business after, you know, the lockdown is over, means that they need to get paid at a rate that makes that worthwhile. I think if it was less, then you'd get employees pushing to be paid more and or, you know, pushing their employer, who would then make them redundant. So the job retention scheme wouldn't do what it set out initially to do, which is to save jobs. And I think that's the reality. It's a balance.
Yeah. So just thinking about that, what you mentioned earlier about what other countries are doing. Where are we in the UK compared to other countries in regards to the furloughing scheme? Are we at the better end or the less generous end, or are we somewhere in the middle?
I think we're broadly consistent. America's a bit of an outlier, and that's where the term furlough seems to have come from. I think it's been used there for a long time, and it can be used for either for seasonal work or if there's just a sudden downturn. Obviously, they tend to have more employment at will there anyway, but the idea of furloughing is that there is an expectation that the employer will bring the individual back into the workforce. But in terms of percentages, in some cases it's 50%. I think in Denmark it's 75%. In others, there's just a general allowance paid per employee rather than based on any particular percentage. But it's all done with government intervention, which is standing in place of the normal contractual rights between an employer and an employee. And I think that just demonstrates what an exceptional step that is, because they wouldn't normally interfere in that way.
No, certainly. I think you mentioned, I mean, obviously we jested slightly towards the end of your piece about the number of questions that there are, but do you think there's anything else the government has not done yet that they should be looking at? Is there anything that either you've seen from other areas or from the experience you're getting with your clients at the moment? Is there anything the government really should look at doing quite urgently to try and help people?
I think there are some issues around what appears to be a real discrepancy that sort of come to light with lower paid workers who really can't afford to stay at home, and so they are pushing to come into work. Their employer may want them to come into work, and in other instances employees are frightened to go into work because they think they're being exposed. And I've had instances of people suggesting that people in their workplace have got COVID and they're still working, and what can they do about it? So I think there's a lot of angst around, and there are actually claims that can be brought in the employment tribunal for people who, they call it suffering a detriment. So if you had an individual who was concerned about their health and refused to go into work, would that be reasonable? Could they be dismissed? So I think we need some clarity around what is an unreasonable fear and what is a legitimate fear, and when can employees really be asked, quite properly by their employer to come into work, and when not. And I think that probably it's difficult because people's perception of risk is different. But I think we probably, certainly as we go into lockdown being, if not, slowly let off, but there is going to be a relaxation at some point, and I think that will have to be managed very carefully.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, and it's something that I know at the start of this process, it was a big question. It was one of the big issues being raised, particularly by Labour Party MPs in Parliament, saying, what about people on 0 hours contracts? Exactly as you were saying, those people who need to work to be able to afford to live, and whether the pressure of them going to work is actually detrimental. I do wonder, from my political head now Parliament is back and ministers are being quizzed by MPs more, I wonder whether we'll see that being pressed a lot more as it was at the start of this, because I think certainly in the last few weeks that doesn't feel like it's been pressed so hard on the government. So I do wonder if that's something to look out for. So we're coming close to the end of our time now, because we never want our briefing webcast, webinar to run on too long, but I always like to try and finish on a real positive note, because I do think that despite everything, and I know that there are people who have really struggled and suffered during this process, but we always want to try and put a positive at the end of each webinar that we do. So Alison, I've asked most of the people who've been on is, what do you think is a positive outcome from the crisis that we're in? Is there something that we can take away of saying, well, we're pleased that this has happened, or there's a trend that's been taking place that actually, you know what, I'm really pleased this has taken place? Yeah,
I think the positive, I would say, is that it's given everybody, so both employers and employees, the opportunity to take a pause, which I think we just don't get. Everybody goes at 100 miles an hour, and whether that's at home and at work, and you just are cracking on with stuff, and you're not necessarily questioning whether it's the right stuff that you're doing in the right way. And I think everybody's had an opportunity to do that. I think there's been a big focus on the need for businesses to really engage with their staff. They've had to agree some of these significant changes in people's contracts and terms. So I think that's been highlighted, and I think people will think, can we do things differently? Some employers are traditionally, very much office-based or factory-based, and they've had to adapt very quickly. And I think sometimes pressure really makes people make decisions, and sometimes, they end up being good decisions that they can adopt for the future. So I think this opportunity just to stand back and say, you know what, there's some good things that we are now starting to do, and we should do that more once the lockdown comes off. No,
I absolutely agree with you. I think remote working, flexible working, I think is going to be a completely different when we come out of lockdown than it was beforehand. I know a lot of employers supported it and used it a lot and were big advocates for it, but I think now people have really seen and demonstrated how in these circumstances you can work far more flexibly and remotely working from home and using technology far more than was ever envisaged before this. So now I completely agree with you, and I hope it is something that we can take away going forward with it. So on that, thank you very much, Alison, for joining me today. I really enjoyed it, really interesting, and I think it'd be quite good possibly in a few weeks' time to bring you back, if that'd be okay, to talk about how things have gone, how firms are managing, and particularly if we do need to look at beyond the June deadline for furlough, if things need to be extended, it'd be great to get you back in again to have a chat, if that'd be okay.
Yeah, delighted.
Lovely. With that then, thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. I hope it's been helpful. If you do have any questions you've not been able to ask, please feel free to get in touch with myself or the Pro Manchester team and we'll look to answer them. As always, Grayling is still doing our daily briefing, which is a summary of the day's news, particularly from the government's evening press conference, but also any other news that's taken place during the day. If you're interested in being added to the mailing list, I know Alison has, because Alison's been added in the last couple of days, so she's been getting them. Again, just get in touch with me if you want to be added and we'll make sure you're getting that. So thank you again, and I'm just going to pass you back over to Catherine to wind up.
Brill, thank you so much, Chris and Alison, for coming on the webinar today and sharing your insights with us. Really appreciate it. I will send around Alison and Chris's details if you do want to get in contact, like Chris said, drop them a question and have a chat that way. I'll also be uploading this webinar to YouTube, so if you want to watch it again or you want to send it on to someone else to view, feel free to do so. I will send that link around tomorrow morning. Next week's webinar will be a little bit different. It'll be Kat from Grayling hosting it for us, and she's going to have a chat with Sasha Lord, who is the nighttime economy advisor for Greater Manchester. They're going to be chatting about what's going on in Manchester, how do we stand out as a city, and all that sort of fun stuff. So I will send around the link to sign up to that webinar as well in the email. But yes, thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next one.